Welcome, Cult Hackers. I'm Celine, a media graduate with interest in cults.
And I'm her dad. I'm Stephen Mather. I'm an organisational psychologist with an interest in cults because I was raised in one. I left when I was about 30. So, yeah. And it feels like it's a long time since we did this, Celine. I've been on a bit of an adventure since, which we talked about. But it's really nice to be back. And who better than to have as our first guest since coming back, the one and only Dr. Alexandra Stein. Welcome, Alex.
Thanks. I don't think I've ever been introduced as the one and only, but indeed I am the one and only.
You absolutely are.
If you Google me, you might find some images that aren't suitable, as somebody else has that name, and so that's quite interesting as well.
I haven't noticed that. I've seen that there's some quite old pictures of you in there.
Yeah.
As a very young woman, but so you've been fighting this fight for some time, I think, haven't you?
I have. I'm in it for the long haul, but it's also interesting because as I've been in it for the long haul as well, you do kind of see the long view, which is, different than when one's first out of a cult and sort of panicky and urgent to change everything, which it is urgent, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen quickly. So
that's literally something you're talking about the other day with our patrons, because we have a Patreon meetup with the listeners, and we're talking about that, weren't we? The experience of, the difference of talking about things freshly out versus, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years plus 15, so on.
Yeah, have you noticed that in terms of your observations of other people, Alex, how people sort of change? I guess everybody's different, but there's a sort of, seems like there's a bit of a process of making sense of life afterwards and how you talk about it. What's your observations on that?
Definitely. I mean, of course, there's a great variety of ways that people come out, and who are the people who want to talk about it or engage in recovery, because many don't. But of the ones who do engage in recovery, I think right off, there's this, for a lot of people, there's this, and I know this was true for me, a desperate need to tell the story.
Yeah.
And I had that so desperately, I wrote a whole book telling my story. And other people similarly, there's many now really great memoirs out. But I think a lot that comes from that urge to tell the truth of what actually happened. But I mean, I always tell the story of I used to be in a group of people, like maybe at a party or something, in the first couple of years after I got out, and pretty soon I was just like, and you'd have this whole ring of people around you. And I'm kind of generally a bit of a shy person socially, so it was quite odd. But the combination of people's interest in cults and my inability to stop talking once I had started on this quite crazy story, as cult stories generally are. So, yeah. And then after a while, that does calm down. And I think, again, for me, and I think for many people, then you start somehow that links to wanting to really understand cults and start reading about them and talking to other people, and then some of us carry on and end up doing academic studies or some other kind of study or activism, and others just get on with life. There's people take different paths.
A few people we've spoken to have said that they kind of needed took a break from it, I guess, thinking about it, just didn't want to engage with it for a while. And then, quite a long period of time later, they've become really interested in exploring it. I mean, that's kind of Dad's experience. You kind of did sort of shut the book on it for a while, didn't you? And then I'm obviously very interested now in talking about it all the time.
I think there's often complications when you leave, of course, because you're also faced with some consequences about talking about it as well. So, part of it is I did have this burning desire to tell people and to talk about it. But on the other hand, I knew that if I did, that could cause extra trouble with people, family, and so that are still in it. So that also suppresses that. So yeah, and it's a complicated story, but I do definitely recognize this feeling, this pent up feeling that you want to just talk about it. I think it's part of the sense making process, to try and understand it yourself, isn't it? Really, that's kind of what you do.
Absolutely it is. And I think the other thing that can slow down that process is when you first get out, you have to restabilize.
Yeah.
You have to invent a whole life. So some people again do that, as I did in a way, along with telling the story and starting to do that. And for others, it's more complicated. I mean, in a way, I was lucky because I had several kinds of resources that a lot of people don't have when they get out. So I kind of consider that I was lucky in a way, and those resources helped me be able to do all those things together. But for other people, they just are fighting all kind of battles and getting out, and there might be custody stuff and all kinds of stuff. And I think for people who are born or raised, as you say, it's a high stakes business, because I mean, you may already have lost all your family, but if you haven't, like you risk that. And these are very big, difficult decisions to make as to when to speak out, and if to ever speak out. And, that's got to be an individual choice.
Yeah, and for some people, I'm sure the right decision is to, try to come to terms with it and maybe talk about it with a counsellor or others that can help you with that. But other than that, to just get on with your life and keep going forward. And I definitely respect people who just want to do that. I think that's absolutely cool. For our listeners, Alex, I'm sure most people know who you are, but just to in case somebody doesn't, of course you're an academic, you've written books about this topic, and you also spent some time in a group. So just very, very briefly, what was the group that you were a member of?
I was a member of a supposedly left-wing kind of socialist political group based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, called the or the Organization. It had various other names, but that was the name I mostly knew it under. And I was in for 10 years, thinking I was supposedly trying to help with social justice, which of course it wasn't. And I got out after 10 difficult years. And just going back to the sense-making thing you were saying, immediately started trying to write about the experience, because I have been a writer at heart. And of course, I hadn't written anything in those 10 years except very boring memos about boring things. And I started writing right away, I say, along with speaking about it. And that was really important, because you're fed an endless stream of lies when you're in the cult. And when you get out, you do have to put together your own narrative of what actually happened to you. And so that was kind of what I did. And that started me on this rather strange career I now have.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how all of these groups seem to have a very grand mission, don't they? The mission is grand. So yours was to save the world, to create social justice through political means. For us, it was to save people's lives through the witnessing and getting them to convert to being a Jehovah's Witness. But the actual activity that you do is really boring and dull. So you were writing boring memos. We were trudging around knocking on empty doors.
Well, we were baking bread. We were working 2 jobs. Our paid job and then another 8-hour shift doing cult work. We were God. It was. Yeah, I think that's a feature that doesn't get talked about a lot about cults. Boring life is, you're doing one thing, you're saying the same things over and over again. You can't do anything interesting, basically, even though it's not that, there were some interesting things. And I think this is hard for people when they get out, because there were some things that were nice. Like I was told to be a machinist, which I don't know what that's called in England, but anyway, it's quite a highly skilled job. Not quite a tool and die maker, but sort of related. Okay. And I enjoyed that. Was interesting, and I enjoyed that experience. And I probably wouldn't have done it. Well, I'm sure I wouldn't have done it if I hadn't been in the cult. But I don't ascribe that to the cult. I mean, okay, they told me to do it, but I'm the one who actually did it.
Yes. Yeah.
And but a lot of the other stuff was really boring. So anyway, yeah.
So the activity is generally quite boring, but you do have this sense of an important mission, and I think this again is why perhaps when you leave, you're almost searching for a new purpose, a new mission, because that there is a bit of a void there. And I think that's another reason why perhaps people get very quickly into activism, or they want to write a book, or do a YouTube channel or whatever. I think there's a kind of need to fill that need to do something important. And I don't know. It's not something that I don't think has been studied really, but it'd be interesting to look into that.
I think it's also like, for me, it was a way both of keeping that social justice mission, which I'd had since childhood because of my particular family background. But also it's a way to make meaning out of an experience that has really shredded meaning in your life and gaslit you about meaning and conned you. And you have all these feelings of shame and grief and loss and anger. And I think it's a way to try to turn that around. And Primo Levi talks about that. He's a wonderful author who was in the neighboring camp to Auschwitz, which I always forget. I think it's Birkenau. No, he was in Auschwitz. What am I talking about? Sorry. Anyway, he's a marvelous author. And he talked about how he had this terrible urge to speak after he got out. And his biggest fear was that no one would believe him, which was often true, that people didn't believe him. It took years for people to get all that evidence about what really happened in the concentration camps. But I think it's a way to take something, and I'm not comparing myself to someone who's in a concentration camp, but they are, they're varying levels of trauma. Let's acknowledge that, but it is a way to make meaning out of a traumatic experience, and in a way to try to take control of that terrible experience.
Is it like that you've mentioned before, is it bricolage?
Yeah, the French word for what the peasants would do. The French peasants would sort of find bits and bobs of bits of wire and bits of cloth and so on. They'd just basically pick these bits up from things people left behind, and they'd make things with them. And this name came to be known as bricolage, and it's used in some psychological literature to kind of explain how people sometimes, especially after trauma, will cobble together bits of identity based on lots of different experiences, some of which was in whatever traumatic experience they had. But I kind of like that concept. I'd like to sort of use it a bit more. It's just a metaphor really, but it's a really interesting one. That's what we do. We kind of cobble together based on what our available resources that we have, and that's kind of that's an interesting concept. So it's about 2 years since we spoke to you. I think it must be. So we're coming up to our third birthday as a podcast.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. We're allowed to celebrate that now. So that's kind of amazing. So it's quite a while since we spoke to you on the podcast. We've spoken quite regularly, me and you, Alex, but on the podcast we haven't heard from you. So what have you been up to? You've been quite busy, I think.
Can I remember what I've been up to? Well, there's the media explosion has carried on, as people in this field are very aware. So I do quite a lot of that. I suppose the thing I think is the best thing that I've been involved with that's come out is the BBC TV program and their podcast, A Very British Cult. And I was very pleased to be part of that. And one thing I do want to say about that, because a lot of us are getting calls to, tell our stories on the media. And that one, and there was another one that hasn't come out yet that I've just recently been involved with, who did some training, and I won't say specifics, with a production company. You know, they actually kind of paid us money, which doesn't usually happen, to give them training about how to be kind of responsible in telling the story, and particularly how to safeguard their interviewees. And the very British cult people, that production company, didn't quite do that, but they did a lot of background research. I mean, I think I talked to them 2 years before the final production. So I'm saying all that to say that there are some productions where they're really doing their homework. They're really trying to understand, just not just go in a voyeuristic, heavy and, you know, damaging way to interviewees, which also happens. And so I'm hoping this shows a level of sophistication and care that's growing in the fields. Definitely won't be the whole field, but in reputable companies who are. So that is kind of interesting. So the media stuff, you know, I continue doing a small amount of cult recovery counseling, working with the charity FST, and thank you, Stephen, for your fundraising activities, which if anyone else wants to do any kind of charity thing and make us the donee, no, whatever it's called, and donate to FST, we desperately need support, and we make very good use of all funds in the support group and campaigning and other activities. So that's just a plug there.
Absolutely.
But yeah, quite busy with the charity. I recently, during the last few years, wrote a chapter for a book that's coming out on, it's a 7-volume series from Oxford University Press, on extreme beliefs and behavior. And I was asked to do a chapter kind of trying to link and talk about the overlaps of a bunch of related concepts: extremism, cults, violent extremism, conspiracism, apocalypticism.
Wow.
It was quite challenging, but
sounds really interesting. Can't wait to read that.
I don't write much for academic things, but this seemed an important one to, and I was, you know, I'm always honored when people ask me to do things like that. When did I do the January 6th committee? I don't know if I talked about that.
I've not heard about that at all.
That was actually a career peak in my own estimation. So the US Senate Select Committee on the January 6th insurrection, the invasion of the Capitol that Trump is up on charges for, and along with a lot of other people. So there was this very good committee that did really good work. One of the sort of subcommittees, they invited me to write a submission. It's kind of like a bit like a witness statement, talking about how Trump and Trumpism and the various other bits of that insurrection had cultic elements. So that, if anyone's interested, that's both on my website, and I think you can. There's an archive of all the things that were submitted. So that was really interesting, and what I focused on was Trump as a cult leader, classic cult leader, the Proud Boys as something that looked very much like a cult, and very interestingly, the Rod of Iron Ministries, which the Rod of Iron is a spin-off from the Moonies, run by the son of Reverend Moon.
Right.
And they were there with weapons, and there were many other groups there, but I focused on those 3 elements and just went through kind of the cult definition I used and said, this is where they fit. So that was interesting. Yeah. So
that is fascinating. I didn't realize you'd done that. That's really interesting. So we actually reviewed Stephen Hassan's book when it first came out, The Cult of Trump.
Very good book.
Yeah, it is a good book, and I think there were parts of it that I suppose I started from quite a skeptical place, because I've got a worry, as you know, that we don't kind of call everything a cult, because then the word cult has no meaning, you know. So if anything you don't like is a cult, then it sort of diminishes it. But I think he did convince me as I read the book, or at least it became more and more convincing. And then as time's gone on, I think I've become much more willing to sort of see it that way. So yeah, that's obviously your conclusion. What I wouldn't mind just stopping on that for a moment and getting your thoughts on that. So what the arguments that this form of Trumpism is a cult, how would you sort of frame that?
Well, first of all, I think in order to make the argument, you have to have some kind of definition that you work, which, as people will know, I have a definition, and it certainly is very similar to other scholars like Jan Jelavich and Steve and other people. We each have a bit our own take. But so, you know, the charismatic authoritarian leader, you know, so a charismatic bully, Trump, ding, tick. The isolating, steeply hierarchical structure with a lieutenant, an unstable lieutenant layer, and then kind of rings of that go further and further out. Now, he definitely had an unstable lieutenant layer. He was constantly firing people and then promoting other people. I mean, I don't know. People did not stay long, other than his family members. Yeah, that. So the structure looked very much like that. That people were definitely in or out. You know, you couldn't. And then there were all these kind of other groups around him, like the right-wing evangelical groups, which have been around for ages, the churches, that were his base in a way, sort of at the bottom in a way of this pyramid, or near the bottom. So that I saw the structure and the belief system, this kind of fiction that supports, I mean, the stuff that comes out now about Trump, you know, I don't know if you've seen these memes of him as, you know, this bodybuilder with this fantastic body and then this Trump face on it, you know. And you're like, no, I don't think so. You know, they've really made him into a kind of god. And that's sort of this, how the ideology supports the figure of this charismatic person. And it's lies, you know, I mean, we know, you know, there's the famous New No, I think it was the Washington Post that tracked his lies. And I think they got up to like 30-some thousand. You know, he just, every word out of his mouth was a lie. But that also comes down into the ideology that it's just not connected to reality. And it's got all the fear elements, you know, the rapists coming across our border. I mean, these are just poor Honduran refugees who are fleeing the drug trade and utter poverty. And he's calling them rapists. That hit home personally for me, because my kids are adopted from Honduras, and it really upset me. But they're just lies. We're getting a little bit of that in this country. I referred to yesterday. You know, you really got to be careful when they start telling what are obvious lies.
So just let us listeners know what you mean by that. So you're referring to?
I'm referring to Sunak rolling back on the net zero pledges and saying things like, well, we're going to roll back on the meat tax, the compulsory car sharing. What was the other one? The 7 bins, you have to recycle into 7. I mean, these are just lies. And these were
never policies for him to reject, were they?
You know, so they just make up these lies, which are these fear arousing, oh my God, I'm going to be, you know, locked up if I don't car share or whatever. It's extraordinary. But anyway, Trump's the master of that. Rishi Sunak is only just learning how to do it. I'm sorry, I'm putting my politics on my sleeve because I think it matters, you know. And
so I agree. I think he's a smarmy bastard too.
Yeah, and it's gaslighting. It's gaslighting. People start going, well, is there a meat tax? You know, they start questioning themselves, you know. And no, that's just a lie. You don't have to question yourself. You have to question him. So that's the third part of my definition, just this kind of fictional apocalyptic ideology. The fourth part, the brainwashing, the alternating between nice and nasty, to put it I think you can hear that in Trump's speech. There's all this, oh, I love you. Then I can't think of a really good example right now, but then, if you turn on him, he's vicious, and it happens just in the blink of an eye, and it's unsettling. You don't know who you're dealing with. And then my fifth definition is just the exploitation of followers, and my fifth point in the definition. And clearly, all those people who were at the January 6th thing, who were just not maybe directly connected to one of these groups, but so what I call punters, they were just followers, they're going to do jail time. And as they should, but nonetheless, he better do jail time, and that gets us to the whole thing about who's guilty in a cult, and if you don't get the leader, it's really rotten if you're just getting the followers. So I hope he does. Anyway,
I think that's really interesting. A lot of people liken his organization to a criminal boss, a criminal gang, like a mafia style thing. And actually, there's a lot of similarities between those and cults. I mean, the coercive control studies often talk about organized crime in the same breath as cultic groups, because
I think that's how the case was put together for the Raniere case, wasn't it? It was put together as though it was a criminal organization, because it was.
And that's the Trump one. It's the RICO Act, which is a organized crime act, which we don't really have here, I don't think. And the chair of the FST, Tom Sackville, always talks about cults. He says, "Oh, they're just criminal organizations." And I think that's true. They all engage in some kind of criminal activity. It's just we don't always know what it is.
Absolutely.
They do, like hiding pedophiles in the case of the JWs. That's crime. That's what that is.
And hopefully, as the coercive control laws expand, that we can put the definition of criminal activity on it more and more, hopefully.
That is certainly our goal at FST, and I know you wanted to chat about that a little bit.
I do want to definitely talk about that. Just before we leave that, I think the other word that was going through my head was loyalty as well. So demanding loyalty is something that cults, something that criminal bosses, they all have this in common, that the boss, you have to be totally loyal, and any sign of disloyalty is the worst crime in the world. And that's certainly true with Trump. That's one of his things. He absolutely values loyalty above all else, really.
And that it's good for you.
Yes.
And I think I think some criminal organizations, maybe you're just stuck in them and you're just, so to speak, their slave. But the thing about cultic forms and coercive control is that the victim feels it's good for them, or they're supposed to feel that.
Hi, I'm Tracy.
And I'm Sharon. And we are Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters. So way back in the 1970s, we became radical Christians in the Jesus movement.
We were promoted to leadership in the crazy cult commune Last Days Ministries, founded by none other than Christian music megastar Keith Green.
Now we're sharing our decades-long escape from the trauma and abuse of extreme Christianity.
We tell our own stories and also invite guests to talk about fundamentalism, purity culture, arranged marriages, child abuse, misogyny, homophobia, power-hungry patriarchy, and much more.
Much, much more. So join us as we share our journey of healing and humor and how we finally found peace and joy on the other side.
Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters, wherever you get your podcasts.
Did you know it's estimated that there are over 3 million podcasts currently out there? So trying to get noticed and grow listeners is really hard. If you're enjoying this podcast, why not tell a friend about it? We can be found on all the podcast apps, so please tell them to search for Cult Hackers. In fact, why not pause the show right here and do it now? You can find the pod link on our show notes, so you can just copy and paste it into a message or share it using your app. Thank you. Now back to the podcast. Yeah, let's get on to the policy change that as an organisation, the FST, Family Survival Trust, are pushing for. And of course, you've written a proposal for, I suppose, essentially the UK government, but I'd like to talk about the benefits, in terms of worldwide change. But can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think it's kind of a bit of a best kept secret, and I'd love more people to know about it and do something with it. So tell us about that piece that you've written. It's on the website so people can read it.
It's actually a colleague wrote it up, who's a member of our steering committee. But it's something we've talked about as a group, that there is, in 2015, this very good law got passed, the coercive control element of the Serious Crime Act, which talked about, if you go read the guidance, it's got all the elements of what we see in cults, of the way somebody controls somebody else through control of their personal life, their friends, their communication, their money, possibly the way they dress, etc. They isolate them, and I think it talks about they humiliate them, they make them frightened. It's all the elements that are very familiar to anyone who's studied cults or been in a cult. And an important element is that they say at the end is the victim may not be able to acknowledge that they're a victim, which I think is a really important piece. But this great law with these great guidelines, it's restricted to if the perpetrator and the victim are in an intimate or family relationship. So if again, the chair of the charity, Tom Sackville, says, if someone does that to me in my home, who I'm in some kind of family or personal relationship with, in theory, they can go to prison for that. It's a crime. But if my neighbor does it to me, it's not a crime. Or if my workplace does it to me, or my church, it's not a crime. So this makes no sense. It's completely illogical. And I'm sure there's complicated political reasons why it was restricted to that. Again, maybe the power of the churches not wanting to get involved in that. But, I'm not against bona fide religions that don't exploit people. I mean, I myself am an atheist, but I have a great respect for people who have religious and spiritual beliefs, as long as they're not hurting anyone else. Whatever. That's pluralism. That's
absolutely
I'm a believer in. But we feel this is first of all, there are no laws that can really go after cults for cultic coercive control. You can only go after a cult for a specific crime, and that may often end up with a low-level person in the cult being the, quote, criminal. But they're just doing it on orders of the leader, and the leaders get off scot-free. So this is a serious, serious problem. So we would just like to take out that phrase, intimate or family relationship, so that it can apply broadly to whoever's doing this to subjugate a victim for the benefit of the perpetrator by using these controlling mechanisms. So we have that proposal. It's backed up in a way by our piece of research we did about cults in the UK, where we took elements of those guidelines and we did a survey. I think about 105 people responded, explaining their experience in cults per those guidelines. How were they isolated? How were they controlled in these various ways? So we have this piece of evidence. We have a proposal to change the law. Because we have limited resources, we haven't really been able to engage in a campaign, a sort of well-designed campaign that maybe a larger charity with more resources could do. So but the word's getting out. So we've had several articles in the media where they're discussing this, or at least say that this is something we want. Yeah. But we need a lot more oomph behind it. And I think some of the ways we can have some oomph is if more people know about it, if when they're experiencing a cult problem or reporting a past experience, they go to their MP, which, by the way, I think is a really important thing for people to do. MPs are obliged to talk to their constituents, Nadine Dorris notwithstanding. And they tell their complaint about their cult, and then they talk about this and show this proposal and say that, we need better laws to cover this. And there are, France has a better law. They've got a law that criminalizes psychological manipulation, where the perpetrator is seeking to subjugate a victim for their own benefit. Anyway, that's a bit of a long story about that. And I think there's a couple other European countries, I think Belgium and maybe Luxembourg, have similar laws. But we have nothing. So I think we have to tell the politicians, we have to talk about it in the media. Again, a lot of people are being interviewed these days. So we have to bring this up, say, we want this law changed, and here's a suggestion. And I think spread, like you're doing, spreading the words around all these different activists. The ex-Jehovah's Witnesses have a bunch of activists, the exclusive Brethren, or Plymouth Brethren as they are now, and various other groups have, within their ex-member groups, have activists. On that note, that's one of the things we did as a charity recently, had a small beginning meeting of some of those folks. It was very small and modest, but we hope to build on that. Because I think, to change a law is not easy. And it takes, what I would call a movement, and I don't mean that in a grandiose way, but I mean a collection of efforts of a lot of different people from all walks of life and using all different angles to make some noise that there's this terrible cult problem in this country and the world, but laws are bound by country, obviously. Here's what the problem is, and here's one piece of a solution. I mean, we need a lot of other things, but we have to have a law that says we can do something about this.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful summary of where we are in terms of the policy on coercive control. Obviously, we speak to people from different parts of the world, and they often refer to the UK that we have coercive control laws. So it's and I guess that is a good start. We actually have a base there to build on. We're able to say, look, we have this law on the books currently about this very, very topic. It's just that on purpose we've decided to leave out 90% of the actual problem. But at least the law is there, so we can then say, well, actually the hard bit's been done, that the principle that individuals can be coercively controlled, brainwashed, if you like, into doing things that they don't want to do or that's not in their interests, and be trapped inside these organizations or inside these relationships, at least, that has been established in law. All we need to do now is move it on to, as I say, 90% of the incidents that are actually happening. And I think that, in terms of changes around the world, that, could be a way for other nations, other activists of other nations to say, look, the UK's done it. Why don't we do it? So I think it could be a really important thing. It's a really valuable opportunity that we've got here. So yeah, we'll definitely put the link on our show notes to that document, which people can download and read. It's on a PDF. They can then use it as the basis for, I guess, talking to their representatives, MPs in the UK, and trying to put some pressure, because of course politicians are unlikely to act without pressure from their constituents, I would say.
Well, exactly. And that pressure can come in different forms. It can come in visiting your MP surgery. It can come in letters to the editor. Actually, I think are quite important. I don't write them myself, but there are some people who are good at that. Or little, opinion pieces. calling into radio shows, just, we have to make some noise about it. And if anyone is a good campaigner and organizer and wants to come and help FST, given an understanding of our limited resources and our limited capacity, but we are trying to build that, and part of that is getting expertise from good campaigners who are willing to volunteer some time to help people make this noise.
Yeah, great. Well, again, we'll put a link onto your contact page so that people can reach out to you and the FST. Actually, something quite nice happened on the ride. I obviously, as you know, I broke down early on in the challenge, but on the journey, I got picked up by the support van, and the guy that was driving me back. We got chatting about things, and he asked, I sort of talked about what I was doing this for, or the charity I was doing it for, and the podcast and everything, and he was really interested. He also had a friend who knew quite a lot about Jehovah's Witnesses, and had a pretty nasty experience as he left. But anyway, so I had a little chat to him, and then he sent me a message to say, can you give us the link to the podcast, because everybody was really interested. He obviously told everybody about that, and we actually had a contributor to the fund who contacted me. He said, give me a link to where I can contribute. So that was really nice, and it does just show you. It almost felt like the old days of witnessing, but it does just show you that actually people still don't really know that much. It feels like it's kind of saturation level to us, because we obviously are very aware of everything that's been done, podcasts, YouTube, books, and so on and so on. But actually, there's not that much awareness. And when people do become aware, then I think, given the right conditions, people are quite moved to take a stand. I think people will be surprised at the amount of this that's going on.
I think what my experience is, when I do any kind of public talk or talking to a neighbor, every single time when I sort of explain a bit about what a cult is, I don't even have to necessarily explain a lot. It's just, and that's why I like the word cult, because people do have a bit of a sense of what that is. Mm-hmm. I swear, every time you get people saying, well, yeah, my daughter nearly got into something, or, when I was young, I was in a dodgy group and I never really knew what it was, but I think looking back, it may be every time. So, that's kind of my thesis, or my argument is that, in fact, everyone has some connection to this, and it's incredibly widespread. It's just they haven't got a language and the kind of social space in which this conversation is happening to have the conversation. Mm-hmm. I kind of think it's kind of extraordinary in a way, and continues to surprise me. Just this week, our new neighbors have moved in. I'm chatting, they ask what I do, and I say, and they say, oh yeah, my ex, I won't give details, had some experience of that, Yeah. It's just constant. So I think that's the power of doing good media, not the horrible, because the bad media does the opposite. It's like, well, my daughter wasn't at Jonestown. She didn't drink the Kool-Aid. Mm. But my daughter was in a coercive not my daughter, by the way, in this group that made her work, 24/7. So these more subtle and thoughtful media pieces really help people start to have that language and so forth. So I think the more of that, the more we're seeing people identify this issue. But I agree, we're still a long way away.
And I think it becomes, it's always been important. It becomes even more important when everyone's phones, social media, the cult could be in your pocket at any time, with new groups, with online and things like that. So the fact that people are talking about it online as well. So when you're scrolling through, you're not just, it's all, there's people saying the other side and being like, have you noticed this is a bit weird actually, and this isn't okay? Because it's very easy to get sucked into into the algorithm, because it doesn't really care what content it's presenting you with as long as you're in it. So I guess it's important, hopefully stuff like this content and all the wonderful stuff that everybody makes, people also come across that while they're delving into the cult world. Hopefully we pop up for other people.
I watched an interesting show on BBC a week or so ago about Andrew Tate. There was a good documentary. I needed an edit, but it's worth watching because that's one, obviously Andrew Tate, everyone's worried about that now because all these young men and boys are getting sucked into this. But what was really interesting about the documentary was that, in fact, Andrew Tate isn't the leader. There's actually he has a sort of superior, so to speak, who's teaching him all this stuff. And it is actually a cult. And that is made quite clear in this documentary. So whereas the rest of the media hasn't kind of caught up to that. And I mean, I didn't know that till I watched the documentary. It's not just this one guy with his YouTube channel. It's quite an organized effort. And that's affecting lots and lots of people. That's all over the place. So again, it makes the work we do quite relevant and important to a lot of people.
I was going to say the relevance is really there. So what's your kind of analysis as somebody that's been doing this work for, as you said, the long haul? What's your sort of analysis of where we are in terms of the battle against these sorts of groups? Do you think that we're making headway? Obviously there is a lot more content out there, but it feels like there's a lot more cultic types of groups and behavior going on as well, or is that just an illusion because I'm looking for it? I don't know. What do you've got a sort of wider view.
I mean, this thing about, is there more out there? I suppose there is, but I'm not entirely sure, and I don't think we don't have studies that can tell us exactly that. We're seeing it more, I think, because of the speed of communications that we all experience now. However, I suspect there is more because one of the conditions in which cults thrive is a fragmented society and kind of rapid changes and uncertainty in people's lives, which clearly we're experiencing in all kinds of ways. So I would expect to see more. In terms of the battle against them, I think there is much more media. There's slowly more intelligent media. There's all these podcasts, which are reaching a lot of people. So there is more of, the people always talk about, is the internet making more cults? Well, it is, but it's also making more, like you were saying, it's making more opportunity for people to communicate about them. And for people in cults to find out about their cult, frankly, that's going on too. A lot of, in terms of the coercive control law and trying to change that, I always think about the women's movement, which is really what got the current coercive control law in place. I mean, that was the result of the women's movement. You can't attribute it to anything else. Yeah. And over the long haul. And, I often tell the story about how, in my long ago youth, my friends were working in the very first domestic abuse shelters that were run out of squats. I mean, that hadn't existed before. So from the long view, also being someone who's just turned 69, that was in my early 20s that was happening. And it was only in 2015 we got this law. And the whole discourse around domestic violence has changed radically. Everybody can be a victim of domestic violence, including men. So the discourse has really changed radically. And so I kind of use that a bit as my yardstick. It's like it took a long time, a lot of effort, a lot of different people doing different things. And I think we are at the raising awareness stage. Like, this is a problem, and it's not just a problem in California, the stereotype of cults. It's a problem here in London, in Peterborough, in Scotland, where, it's everywhere. So I think that's kind of the stage where we're at. You have to see and name the problem and make it visible. And I think the storytelling that, for instance, you're giving people a platform is hugely important. How do we know what the problem is unless people tell their stories and the memoirs and the other media stuff? And that has exploded. And even these celebrities telling their stories about they were in Scientology or wherever, that's sort of coming. That all matters and is important. And by the way, a really interesting thing is the French. So this is a digression, so you might have to bring me back if I forget where I was. So the French have a ministry, a ministerial office that deals with cults. So the French have been very progressive on this. Well, the funding got kind of cut a couple of years back, but the new Minister of the Interior has given back all the funding and is putting a lot more emphasis on it. Interesting. Who is the Minister of the Interior? She was brought up in Scientology.
Wow. How interesting.
So that, it's fascinating to me. So there are people who have direct, as we now call it, lived experience, who are perhaps getting into certain positions of power or are becoming academics or media people who are actually able to understand this problem from the inside. So I think all these pieces start making this a known problem. Like if you look at the county lines thing, nobody really knew about county lines, but then the media went after it. And now a lot of people sort of know that a lot of drug stuff happens through these county lines and exploitation of underage kids. Well, we're sort of getting there, I think.
I think so. Yeah.
And I think that's snowballing. And so I remain hopeful.
Good.
But if we have to turn that into some political noise so that some action happens out of it, that's, I think, our next step.
I mean, that's been great, and that's made me cheered me up no end, Alex, because I think you're right. There's such an important role to play. Everybody has that opportunity to tell their story if they want to, if they can. Some of us have the look to be able to do a podcast or a YouTube channel, or and then we have academics like yourself who write books and do research. And there's more and more of those. There's quite a few ex-Jehovah's Witnesses now that are in academia that study these things. We've interviewed one or two on our show, and that just makes me so sort of warm in my heart, and a lot of them are women as well, which is really exciting because they were denied a voice during their time within the group, or at least a significant voice, and now they're able to really make a contribution. So I think it's really exciting what's happening.
And the Jehovah's Witnesses, as an example, I mean, if you think back, I don't know, 10 years or some time ago, people just thought, and they still mostly think, well, they're these quirky people who go around knocking on doors and they're not really harming anyone. But now we've had things like that brilliant film Apostasy. We've got these podcasts. We've got these organized groups of people. We've got their protests at the convention. Again, it's not that widespread, but people are starting to get an idea that actually maybe this is a group that needs to be looked into a bit more closely.
Yeah.
We cannot get that without people telling their stories. How? Because that's the only way we can know. Yeah. Which is a big beef I have with many sociologists of religion and apologists, because they try to discount the stories of ex-members. But that's, it's like saying to Primo Levi, we don't believe what happened to you in Auschwitz. We need an academic study of what happened. Yeah. Because you're too subjective about it. I mean, that's what they say about us as ex-members. But these are closed, secretive organizations. The only way to know what happens is from ex-members. The academics, the outside academics, can only know what's presented to them, which is generally a fiction. And some might try to infiltrate, but they can't get all the way in without really converting. It's just difficult. The demands are too difficult. So it's very limited I'm not saying that work isn't important, and really good work has been done by outside academics.
Yeah.
But it is limited, and you have to have contact with ex-members to find their stories to get a full picture. So the
Absolutely.
work is very important.
Well, I think it's something we have talked about very recently, actually, the why people do these sorts of things, whether it be activism or podcasts or whatever. Why are we doing this stuff? And I think some people think it's just hate and viciousness, but I don't believe it is that. I think it is, as you said, there's a kind of human need to make sense of it by telling your story. There's a feeling that you don't want other people to go through it. And there is you want to be believed. You want people to know the reality of that experience. So I think we need all of those. We need the academic studies. We need the fine. I think these groups. I want to hear what they've got to say, and then we can see whether that actually matches up with people's experience when they come out. So let's actually have all that information. I'm more than happy for all that data to come in, and then let's analyze it through these different methods. I mean, part of the problem for, I guess, a sociological perspective is from an ethical perspective. If you're doing an ethnographic study, for instance, you can't really go in there undercover and pretend that you're a convert. You from an ethical perspective, you're expected to collaborate with the group itself. So, even from the very start of it, you're kind of on a bit of a loser, I think.
Right, exactly. Absolutely, that's true.
Yeah. Celine, have you got any final questions that you want to ask?
I kind of got
Alex?
them as we went, really, because I was going to say my only other thing that I wrote down was about like the online thing, but we just got onto that naturally. So
cool.
Okay.
Is there anything you want to say, Alex, that we didn't cover?
And I just think it's really positive that there are these ways for people to hear the inside stories about what's going on. And I know you do other stories too, but it's really good information. It's really,
well, I mean, we want to say how much we admire you and thank you so much for the continued stuff you're doing. I mean, it's many ex-academics or people who have been in your position would probably sort of put your feet up and just let others do it. But you're still incredibly active in this scene. So,
my feet are up more often than they used to be. Young people. Well, I'm young people are getting active.
They are.
I want to be able to support them because I am getting a little tired. It's true.
Completely understandable. So I suppose that's a call to action. So let's help Alex. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on the show again. It's always brilliant to have you on. Thank you for your continued work. We'll put all the links to the Family Survival Trust on the show notes and your website as well, so people can reach out if they want to. Thank you so much for being on the show, Dr. Alexandra Stein.
Thank you both, Celine and Stephen.